New York Times. The Fed pretended to be helping stimulate the economy by reducing interest rates to near zero. It would be an interesting exercise to find out how much of that low-cost money went where. What was it spent for? It would certainly be a good subject for congressional attention. How much did the banks use to buy up domestic and foreign assets at fire sale prices? Was any of it used by financial institutions to try to corner world food markets and raise prices at a time when millions of people are starving? Well, no doubt some taxpayers did take advantage of the low interest rates, but were they warned about the old bait and switch game? Anyone who acquires assets with cheap money runs the risk of losing their property when the Fed ultimately raises rates. It's all part of the boom-bust cycle inherent in our infinitely silly monetary system. What does this have to say about the economics profession? What it really says isn't fit to print. Someone said that if you put 20 economists in a room, you will get 21 opinions. That is not my experience. If you get 20 economists together, they are likely to give you one stock answer, or at most two. And if there is one dissenter, he or she is likely to be drowned out by the 19, squawking like a flock of parrots the words memorized from their professors' mouths. Well, I have witnessed the herd-like mentality firsthand. When I was first elected to the House of Commons in 1949, there were only a handful of Keynesians in Ottawa. 20 years later, everyone was a Keynesian, including, I'm told, Richard Nixon. At that time, there were only a few monetarists around, but they spread like mushrooms and soon dominated the economic landscape. It reached the stage where Keynes was anathema, and it was almost impossible to get a tenured position in a school of economics unless you were part of Milton Friedman's monetarist revolution. Apparently, little, if any, thought was given to the possibility that neither Keynes nor Friedman had got it right. The former was a bit closer to reality than the latter, but both theories foundered on the rocks of one inescapable truth. Both assumed that the economic system is self-correcting. Yet more than 2 centuries of experience has demonstrated clearly that it is not. Someone has to be at the tiller, charged with steering clear of the shoals and rocks of economic disaster. And that person has to be someone who is responsible to the people and not the self-governing, self-serving boom-busters. While bank reform is the most urgent problem facing the world today, it is global warming that has equally or even greater long-term consequences. It is a total fraud to pretend that we have 30, 40, or 50 years to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There are reputable scientists who think that we have already crossed the Rubicon. Even if that is true, we can't roll the clock back. We can only influence the present and the future. Each of the past 3 decades has been the hottest on record. According to a report released in July 2010 by the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, all of the indicators are worrisome. And that included data measured by 160 research groups in 48 countries. The data shows that sea levels are rising. Snow cover in the Arctic melts earlier. The average air temperature is rising. Ocean surface temperatures have been rising also. The summer sea ice is declining. Sea air temperatures have been rising. For 19 years, glaciers have lost mass. Land air temperature has also been rising, and this is all a global trend. All of this puts the lie to the propaganda of the oil industry aimed at creating doubt about the reliability of the scientific data. Taking a leaf from the tobacco industry, which managed to create doubt about the safety of their products years after they privately knew the facts, the oil industry has been attempting to raise doubt about the urgency of replacing fossil fuels with clean energy. And with considerable success, I regret to say. In their case, however, the stakes are higher. It was a tragedy that so many people lost their lives through lack of sound information about the consequences of smoking. In the case of global warming, however, many times more people will have their lives put at risk. Still, the oil cartel is making plans as if nothing was going to change, and that we are going to be stuck with a fatal oil economy for decades until the damage is irreversible. But let me say, it is too late for more offshore drilling. It is too late for new developments in the Alberta oil sands. It is too late for more noisy windmill farms. The transition must start now, with a 10-year deadline. Is that possible? Of course it's possible, but only with the kind of mobilization essential to win a war for survival, which is really what we're talking about. One excuse for inaction has been the lack of money due to government deficits and debt. But that obstacle can be overcome in less than a year if governments and legislatures change the system and exercise their sovereign right to make what is physically possible financially possible. Heaven knows there are millions of unemployed people, workers worldwide, just waiting to rise to the challenge. The other major obstacle has been a lack of consensus on the form of clean energy to use to replace the fossil fuel economy. And that brings me finally to the subject of the day, the extraterrestrial presence and technology. It is a fraud for the government to pretend that it is not interested in UFOs. In fact, as most of you know, it has been a matter of high and probably preeminent interest for decades. As Richard Dolan told us, I think it was yesterday, an early Canadian ufologist, Wilbert Smith, who was a senior employee at the Department of Transport, where I later became minister, not long before I actually arrived there, wrote a top-secret memorandum to the Controller of Communications, dated November 21st, 1950, asking permission to set up a group to study the geomagnetic aspects of UFOs' propulsion systems. And as part of the memorandum, Smith said that he had made discreet inquiries through the Canadian Embassy staff in Washington, and he had obtained the following information: that the matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the H-bomb. Flying saucers exist. Their modus operandi is unknown, but a concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. The entire matter is considered by the United States authorities to be of tremendous significance. So, Dr. Vannevar Bush, who was one of America's preeminent scientists at the time, and a team of experts he had assembled, were already working on back engineering by 1950. Many people who are interested in the subject of UFOs use one of the Roswell crashes of July 1947 as their starting line. Recent evidence, however, confirms that the U.S. Army Air Corps was in the crash retrieval business even before that. Paula Harris, on July the 5th, 2010, interviewed two men, Jose Padilla and Remy Baca, who were aged 9 and 7 at the time, who witnessed a saucer crash on Padilla land near San Antonio, New Mexico, in August of 1945. In her new book, Exopolitics, Stargate to a New Reality, Paula gives the detailed account of what these men saw as children. The actual crash, the creature's appearance, the pieces of the craft that they took, the military cleanup, and an in-depth analysis of the significance of the case. Well, I had the opportunity to chat with Remy Baca by telephone recently, and the thing that stuck in my mind was that when Sergeant Avila came to ask Mr. Padilla permission to enter his land to retrieve the object, quote unquote, he referred to it as, quote, an experimental weather balloon. Doesn't that sound familiar? That was exactly the same ruse that Brigadier General Roger Ramey used in reference to the Roswell incident 2 years later. Apparently, there was a considerable lack of imagination on the Army's part. In later years, the Air Force that had succeeded the Army Air Corps became much more sophisticated in its misinformation and disinformation techniques. These include having the star visitors portrayed in movies as sinister beings that we should be fearful of, probably without justification. Another fascinating case that Paula brought to my attention not long ago was that of Charles Hall, the physicist and information technology professional who worked as an airman meteorologist at the USAF bombing and gunnery range at Indian Springs, Nevada in the 1960s. Charles worked in close contact with tall whites, a species that I had been previously unfamiliar with. And over a period of months, he learned to lose his fear of the aliens who lived, worked, and played on Air Force property. In a 2-hour telephone conversation, he gave me many of the characteristics of the whites, described the scout ships in which they traveled around, and said most of them had been assembled in the United States. Furthermore, he talked about the mothership arriving on the nights of the full moon and sliding into its hangar cut into the side of a mountain nearby. It was all fascinating stuff that included the fact that the tall whites were working closely with the USAF and exchanging technology in the mid-1960s. So it is very difficult to imagine how much has been achieved in 60 years of back engineering. There is no doubt that myriad scientists, technicians, and many of America's most advanced aircraft and weapons corporations must have achieved what would have been classified as miracles just a few years ago. As Michael Schratt demonstrated clearly Thursday morning, that is the case. And as interesting as S4 is, with its special designation, it isn't the only installation, as you well know. There are others, and there are a lot of things that we still don't know. It is probably a fact that U.S. engineers working in one of the vast underground facilities have built vehicles that are virtually indistinguishable from those of other planets. Now what we want to know is to what purpose they will be put. Will it be for good purposes or military purposes? Could I have a little glass of water, please? The area of discovery that is most relevant to this presentation, however, is the question of exotic energy sources. Years ago, it was reported that both zero-point and cold fusion energy had been developed. These are energy sources that could facilitate the 10-year target date and not only revolutionize the world for the better, but help preserve it as a happy habitat for earthlings. Here's down here, thank you. In the unlikely event that these sources are not yet commercially viable, all we would have to do is ask one of the friendly species to help us, and they would certainly do that because they are deeply concerned about our stewardship of our planet. In the event that we are still treating them as enemy aliens and doing our best to shoot them down, we would have to curb our lust of conflict and adopt an acceptable level of intergalactic civility. The third essential change is for us as individuals. A just and peaceful world is not possible when it is riddled with graft, fraud, and corruption of all kinds. Greed is king, and mammon rules the world. Institutions have to change too. For centuries, major religions have been selling their alleged superiority or exclusiveness at the point of a sword, leading to the deaths of thousands of innocents. The three Abrahamic religions, for example, all claim the inside route to paradise. Mathematically, that is impossible. It is far more probable, mathematically, that they are all wrong and that the truth is larger and much more inclusive. Ancient and modern history both suggest that there is no hope of a just and peaceful world unless all religions and those with no religion forget their differences and start working together to build the kingdom of God on earth. And I define this as a world where every child can expect food to eat, clean water to drink, adequate clothing, a roof overhead, access to medical support, and enough education to be able to determine how best he or she can serve humankind positively with dignity and self-fulfillment. What a wonderful world that would be. But it would require a 180-degree change in policies and priorities, and a serious effort to apply the golden rule that all religions claim as a common thread. The application of the golden rule would mean an end to empire building and the pursuit of military power and advantage. The US, for example, would have to stop being its own worst enemy. The declaration of war on terror was the biggest strategic blunder I have ever seen. On the 11th day of September 2001, following the attacks on the World Trade Center, the United States enjoyed the sympathy of the world, including Arab states and populations. The threat from al-Qaeda was limited and quite within the potential of police and intelligence operations to cope with. The situation changed dramatically with the launch of a war on Iraq. The goodwill began to evaporate overnight. Soon, instead of a few dozen insurgents, the number of young Muslims willing to die for their cause multiplied to thousands, and a great chasm of hate and mistrust enveloped much of the world. The U.S. has consistently refused to be even-handed in the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, and the Israelis deceive themselves and the world when they claim to be the victims. For a long while, peace has been within their grasp if they could have agreed to a just settlement and establishment of a vibrant Palestinian state. But a handful of fundamentalists have always succeeded in disrupting the peace process because they are not willing to accept the great Rabbi Hillel's admonition, and I quote, "So always treat others the way you would want them to treat you. That is the message of the law and the prophets." Meanwhile, the peace and stability of the world remain in jeopardy. The world community must adopt principles and practices that override fundamentalism of any stripe, whether it be Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or economic. In addition, religious people should pay more attention to their holy books. There is nothing in the Bible that would legitimize a preventive war with its carpet bombing, or the launch of a drone or missile intended to kill one person when there is risk that innocent bystanders will also die. Similarly, there is nothing in the Quran that would justify suicide bombing that result in the random death of innocents. Now, if you get the impression that the world is going to hell in a handbasket, you have read me correctly. But, and here's the good news, it doesn't need to be so. There are remedies, but they involve massive change in the areas discussed, none of which are even on the political radar at present. There is light at the end of the tunnel, but, as Sir John Quinton, the former chairman of Barclays Bank, said, bankers sometimes look on politicians as people who, when they see light at the end of the tunnel, order more tunnel. What we are really talking about is restoring democracy to countries that not only claim that they have it, but also take pride in trying to export it, even though they don't really qualify as democratic as defined in the dictionary. In Webster's, it is government, and I quote, "government in which supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them or their elected representatives," end of quote. Well, to begin, Wall Street has been the dominant power in the US for decades and still is. Add to that the fact that the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, the President of the United States, does not have the security clearance for a number of projects controlled by troops under his command, and you have to conclude that the US may not qualify as a democracy under the dictionary definition. The same can be said about Canada, the United Kingdom, Germany, and myriad countries that are really puppets of the international financial system. In each